Welcome to Manifested e-learning platform. Today we discuss on minimum tax. A background information on the minimum tax, we say this was basically brought forth by the Finance Act of 2020 and became effective on 1st of January 2021. What is minimum tax? When you say minimum tax, what do we mean by the word minimum tax? We call minimum tax what we call a base income tax that is chargeable to persons regardless of whether they're making profit or they're not making profit. I have said precisely that this was brought to effect in the year on 1st January 2021. So we can say this, minimum tax, minimum tax is a base income tax, is a base income tax, payable, say payable, by all persons, regardless of whether, we say regardless of whether, or not making profits. So whether the business is making profit or not, then minimum tax is levied. What is the rate of minimum tax? We need to discuss rate of minimum tax, rate of what you call the minimum tax. Rate of what you call the minimum tax. So the rate of the minimum tax was basically 1% of what you call the gross income. We don't look at the expense, but you say 1% of the gross income. We say that the rate of minimum tax, the rate of minimum tax was 1% of what you call the gross stock turnover. Gross stock turnover, or 1% of the gross sales, gross turnover, 1% of the gross turnover. Turnover is basically same as sales, gross turnover of a company. Gross turnover of a company. So essentially, when you look at the when you look at the minimum tax, it was basically to bring all companies into paying tax. Whether a company was making a loss or a company was making a profit, then essentially all companies were basically paying tax. Then we say that when due dates of the minimum tax, tax. Essentially, what was the minimum due dates of the minimum tax? We have said that the minimum tax was brought by the Finance Bill of 2020, but effected on 1st January 2021. What was essentially the due dates for the minimum tax? You see, it was paid in installment. We say paid in installment. Paid in installment, and due on the 20th of the following. We say on the 20th of the following. Paid in installment, due on 20th of the following. Periods ending. On the following, paid on 20th of the following, 20th of the following periods, ending. We say ending. On the 4th, we have the 6th, the 9th, and what we call the 12th, ending on the 4th, that is on April, if the finance starts from January, on the 12th month of the year. Month of the year. So we say it paid installment and was due on the 20th of the following periods, ending on the 4th, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th month of the year. That is what was basically the period's installment tax was not installment, but minimum tax was due. When you look at minimum tax and installment of tax and installment tax, there was a little bit of more or less similarity. There was a little bit of more of similarity, because if you look at the installment tax that is payable by companies, that was basically also on those dates, the 4th, the first installment is on the 4th, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th month, and the 12th month. The question is, was installment tax still applicable? Was installment tax still applicable when we had what we call the minimum tax? Was installment tax still applicable? And the question is very precise, that still the installment tax was still applicable. Whether we were paying the minimum tax, the installment tax was applicable by persons who paid higher than the minimum tax. So we say the question that installment tax was still applicable. Installment tax was still applicable by persons higher than the minimum tax. For those individuals who are paying a higher installment tax than the minimum tax, installment tax was still applicable. Then person shall pay that. However, we need to understand, instances where minimum tax was more than, instances where minimum tax was more than installment tax. However, on instances where we had minimum tax being more than installment tax, then minimum tax, then we say minimum tax would be payable. Instances where minimum tax was more than the installment tax, then minimum tax would be payable. So incomes that were exempted, incomes exempted from minimum tax, incomes exempted from the minimum tax, incomes exempted from the minimum tax. Essentially, what were the incomes that were basically exempted from minimum tax? We say that employment income, one of it was employment income. Employment income. We had the employment income. We had income that is subjected. Income subjected to residential, what we call the residential income tax. These ones were not applicable to the minimum tax. We have what we call income subject to turnover tax. Incomes subject to what we call turnover tax. This was not subjected to the minimum tax. income subject to turnover tax. We also have incomes of extractive sectors, incomes of what we call extractive sectors, income subject to incomes of extractive sector, income subject to capital gain tax. We have incomes subject to capital, what we call the capital gain tax, income that was subject to capital, what we call the capital gain tax. And lastly, we can add one, what we call incomes subject to incomes exempted by the Act. Incomes exempted by the Act. Incomes exempted by the Act. For example, when you talk about dividends, like we were mentioning, we talked about dividends from outside the country that is exempted from tax. So such incomes were not applicable for minimum tax. Such incomes were not applicable for the minimum tax. What was the rationale behind charging minimum tax? What was the rationale behind charging? Apart from raising revenue, because it was subject to taxation for those that were making profit, and for those that were also not making profit. So basically the rationale was to foster equity and fairness in the tax system. The rationale was to basically foster what we call fairness and in the tax system, equity and fairness in the tax system, as everyone was supposed to be involved in contribution of the tax. However, if you look at minimum tax presently, this is not effective. The minimum tax was not able to go through. That's why a lot of times when you look at the times that we are in, there's not much application of it, of the minimum tax, because individuals had to go on court to shoot this down, especially on issues that were pertaining to the losses, especially companies that were making losses. Whether it made sense, was that equity to tax a company that is actually going down, to charge it tax. So this was meant to be, but this was not actually implemented fully. That is essentially on what you call the minimum tax.